Someone in your group just took more than their share of the meat. You watched it happen. Your jaw tightened. Your pulse went up. And now you are sitting across the fire from them, and everyone in the group can feel it. This is one of the oldest emotional situations in human history. And how your ancestors handled it, how they survived it, shaped something inside you that is still running today. Modern life gives you institutions when conflict arises. Laws, HR departments, courts, bosses. The ability to simply walk away from someone and never see them again. Your ancestors had none of that. For roughly 300,000 years, your group was between 15 and 50 people, moving together, sleeping near each other, depending on each other for survival every single day. There was no walking away. There was no calling the police. There was only the group, and whatever happened inside, it had to be resolved inside it, or the whole thing collapsed. So how did they do it? The first thing to understand is that conflict in small-scale hunter-gatherer societies was not rare. It was a constant feature of daily life, built into the structure of groups that had no private property, no personal space, no separation between public and personal, and no legal system to enforce anything. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent decades studying exactly this question, compiling data from hundreds of documented forager societies and presenting his findings in his landmark book, Hierarchy in the Forest. What he found was that human groups developed extraordinarily sophisticated systems for managing anger and dominance, not by eliminating conflict, but by building social structures that constantly redirected it. The centerpiece of these systems was something researchers now call reverse dominance hierarchy. In most primate groups, a dominant individual holds power through physical force or threat of force, and everyone else falls in line. But in human hunter-gatherer bands, something unusual happened. The group banded together to prevent any single individual from dominating the rest. If someone started acting too aggressive, too controlling, too dominant, the group responded with a graduated series of social sanctions. It started with ridicule. Then came open criticism, then ostracism, and in extreme cases where an individual's behavior threatened the group's survival, it could end in something more permanent. This wasn't a written code. It was a living, constantly enforced social contract, maintained through thousands of tiny daily interactions. Anthropologist Polly Wiessner, who spent over 40 years studying the Hoansi people of the Kalahari, documented in detail how this enforcement actually worked. One of the most powerful tools was what she describes as firelight talk, the extended evening conversations that hunter-gatherer groups engage in after the day's work is done. While daytime conversation tended to focus on practical matters, nighttime talk around the fire was dominated by storytelling, humor, and discussion of social relationships. And embedded within that storytelling was constant social calibration. Praise for cooperative behavior, subtle or not so subtle mockery of selfishness, and the communal reinforcement of the group's shared values. Stories weren't just entertainment. They were the mechanism through which the group regulated itself. What happened when ridicule and social pressure weren't enough? Here is where it gets more complex. When genuine interpersonal conflict broke out, when two members of a group truly could not tolerate each other, the most common solution in documented forager societies was not confrontation. It was fission. The group split, one person or family unit peeled off and joined a neighboring band, or moved to a different part of the territory. This was possible because bands in most forager societies maintained fluid membership, what anthropologists call fission-fusion dynamics, meaning people moved between groups relatively freely. Conflict resolution through separation was available in a way that it simply is not in a modern fixed-address society. What happened when ridicule and social pressure weren't enough? Here is where it gets more complex. When genuine interpersonal conflict broke out, when two members of a group truly could not tolerate each other, the most common solution in documented forager societies was not confrontation. It was fission. The group split, one person or family unit peeled off and joined a neighboring band, or moved to a different part of the territory. This was possible because bands in most forager societies maintained fluid membership, what anthropologists call fission-fusion dynamics, meaning people moved between groups relatively freely. Conflict resolution through separation was available in a way that it simply is not in a modern fixed-address society. There is something worth sitting with in that fact. The ability to leave was not a failure of the social system. It was a feature of it. Your ancestors designed their lives around mobility precisely because mobility was a release valve. When a situation became genuinely untenable, you could go. You could join your sister's band 2 valleys over, or your mother's cousin's group near the river, and you would be welcomed. The network of bands was not a collection of isolated units. It was a fluid, interconnected web of relationships that allowed for exactly this kind of managed exit. Conflict was not always resolved. Sometimes it was dissolved by distance, by time, and by the slow repair of relationships that happened when 2 people who needed each other eventually ended up in the same group again. But what about the anger itself? What happened inside the body? Biological anthropologist Robert Sapolsky, whose research on stress physiology spans decades and multiple primate species, has documented the physiological cost of unresolved social conflict in extraordinary detail. Chronic stress from ongoing interpersonal tension suppresses immune function, disrupts sleep, impairs memory formation, and accelerates cardiovascular disease. These are not minor effects. In a small forager band where you literally depend on the health of every member for collective survival, a chronically stressed individual was a liability the group could not afford to carry indefinitely. The social mechanisms that managed conflict were not just psychologically important, they were biologically necessary. So let's reconstruct what a conflict episode actually looked like 50,000 years ago. Someone in your band has been taking a larger share of the food for 3 days running. Others have noticed. The first response is not confrontation. It is talk. Specifically, it is talk that happens away from the offending person, but within earshot. Someone makes a comment with a slight edge. Others laugh. The tone is pointed but wrapped in humor. The person being criticized almost certainly hears it. This is the first pressure. If the behavior continues, the criticism becomes more direct. Someone raises it at the evening fire. Not as a formal accusation, but woven into conversation. Perhaps through a story about another group, a fictional situation, in which a character behaves the same way and suffers consequences. Everyone understands the point. The person being criticized is expected to acknowledge it, adjust, and demonstrate through subsequent behavior that they have heard the group. If they don't, the pressure escalates. People stop including them in conversations. Eye contact diminishes. Portions at the meal are distributed with slightly less care. The social warmth that is the currency of band life begins to visibly cool. For a creature as socially wired as a human being, this is genuinely painful. The same neural systems that process physical pain process social rejection. Being excluded from your group did not just feel bad. In evolutionary terms, it was a threat to survival. Here is the counterintuitive twist. The most dangerous members of a hunter-gatherer band were not the most aggressive. Research across multiple forager societies consistently shows that chronic aggressors, people who repeatedly intimidated or dominated others without successfully using the group's de-escalation channels, were not tolerated indefinitely. Boehm's cross-cultural data shows that in extreme cases, a group member whose behavior posed a persistent threat to group cohesion could be subject to what researchers call lethal sanctioning. Put more plainly, the group could decide that an individual was too dangerous to keep. This was rare, and it was only ever a last resort after every other mechanism had been exhausted. But its existence tells you something important about the architecture of human social life. The capacity for collective violence was not absent from your ancestors. It was redirected, channeled, used not for the benefit of dominant individuals, as it is in many other primates, but for the maintenance of the group's egalitarian structure. Now think about your own anger. The next time you feel that jaw-tightening, pulse-spiking moment of social frustration, you are running a piece of software that is at least 300,000 years old. Your body's immediate urge to either dominate or withdraw. Your instinct to scan the room for allies. Your sensitivity to the subtle shift when social warmth begins to cool around you. These are not personality flaws. These are the features of a system that kept your ancestors alive in groups of 50 people with no exits and no laws. The system is still running. The group is just different now. Someone in your group just took more than their share. You feel it. So did every human who ever lived. The question your ancestors had to answer every single time was not whether to feel it. It was what to do with it next.